So back when I was growing up, I had a bunch of unsavory shite happen to me and ended up being placed in a foster home. Well, technically it was more of a holding cell for kids to live until they found a real home. Because I was a hurt and untrusting kid at that point, I cycled through my fair share of different families. I remember staying with an obese single man who I don't really remember much about, but I do remember very bad vibes while staying at his house. My case manager must have thought so too, because I was moved to a different home shortly after. That's when I met the family, more specifically the son of a bitch that this story is about. This wouldn't be my last foster home, and I didn't live there long at all, so some things have gotten foggy over the years. I think I was around 8 to 10 years old maybe. It was a real full house with 6 of us in total. My foster mother and father, 2 brothers and a sister. The only person I did not like straight out the gate was my sister. You know that feeling where you just know when someone wants you off this earth? For me, it feels especially raw when it seems unjustified. Like, I know I was technically a foreign invader, a cancer cell in their home or whatever, but guess what? I was a mouthy brat too, and gave her attitude right back. It goes without saying that she and I never got along much. The brothers, on the other hand, well, I loved them. We did everything together, and they made me feel like a part of the family, which is what made what they did to me next so confusing. So far, the only slightly unusual thing about this family was they had this strange intercom system in their home. Mostly, the mother would use it to tell us to go to sleep after hours. A few months go by and summer rolls around. They had been pumping me up about swimming in the pool in the backyard for a while. The only thing was, because I didn't have a lot of normalcy, I didn't even remotely know how to swim, and I was terrified of the open water. On the day this happened, my brothers and I were all out by the pool. They also had a slide they used for the pool area. It went straight into the deep end. Looking back on it, the entire afternoon was basically a setup, like the whole family planned this together. They kept pressuring me to use the slide, and said that they would help me if I couldn't swim to the sides. I really wanted to be like them, free to do things without worrying about the consequences, and I really believed they wouldn't let me drown. I mean, we were supposed to be a family, right? Okay, so I slide down the pool. Seconds later, I'm starting to drown. I don't know which way is up, and I'm fighting for air, something to grab, anything. It seemed like it was going on for way too long. Suddenly, my adoptive father had me barely above the water, holding me up with one hand. If at gunpoint I had to describe his face in that moment, I'd say it was a mix of lust and contempt. It was really blurry and happened fast, but faces like that are hard to forget. "I could let you drown right now, boy." That's what he said to me, those exact words. I don't think he'd ever referred to me as boy at all before that point. I was crying and gasping for air, but he just held me there, with my head only inches above the water. And for what? I still don't understand why. It was one of the 3 or 4 times in my life I truly believed I was going to die. Eventually, after letting me continue to drown, he walked over to the edge of the pool and set me upon it. Right then, I was so terrified of him, I didn't know what to do. I just laid there once I climbed up, and didn't want to be near anyone in that home. I remember one of the strangest things about that experience was the aftermath. We went to a Mexican restaurant that night, and they all acted as though nothing had happened. I was confused, angry, and scared. Maybe it was insignificant to them. Maybe it was not an abnormal thing to them, or perhaps he'd done it to teach me a lesson or something. Well, anyways, fuck that and fuck that family too. Soon after, I updated my case manager on the incident, and I was out of that house within days if I recall. All you people with both parents, try to make things right with them if they aren't. Always appreciate your family, because I don't have any. Anyways, I just wanted to share some of my life with you all. Thanks for listening. This is a true story of something I experienced. It must have been over a decade by now. I was a kid at the time my dad bought this quaint house on the outskirts of a little town. It was a decently sized home with a big backyard, overlooking the marshes and unused farmers' fields. The only entrance to it was either through the house or across the large fields themselves. To put into context how this fits into the story, it was because my bedroom at the time was situated at the back of the house, facing that big backyard directly. I remember one night very vividly, even some 10 to 12 years later. I was sitting in my room doing digital artwork on my computer. It was something I loved to do as a teenager. I'd usually do it while listening to music with my headphones on. The way I was sitting had me facing away from the big window in my room, the largest in the entire house really. I had my blackout blinds drawn, and it was the only room in the entire house that had the light on. I'd assume from the outside you'd be able to see the slivers of light through the edges of the folding blinds. It was between 2:30 and 3 a.m. or so. I was peacefully minding my own business when suddenly I heard a massive slam against my window. It was a dull, loud thud, and then I heard what I thought was a shout. My dad was peacefully sleeping in the room next to me. How he didn't hear anything at the time still amazes me to this day. I remember just sitting there, confused, shaken, and with no clue of what I just heard. That was until it happened again. I heard it loud and clear. Somebody was outside my window in the backyard. Whoever this was had no reason to be there. I remember feeling so scared to open my blinds. Instead, I stood up and just stared at the window, not taking my eyes off it. Something I'm thankful for to this day is that I decided to go with my gut feeling in that moment. My gut was telling me to grab a flashlight and quickly check the front door. It was an old house. I would have to leave the inner comforts of the home to enter the barn to get to the main entrance and check it. I remember shining my flashlight through the glass door. The window had a frosted film for privacy. Sure enough, I barely got the flashlight lifted 3 or 4 inches to the glass before seeing the coat of whoever was skulking out there. The real kicker though? Absolute terror set in when I realized the door was no longer locked. I managed to lock it again and run back inside. The first thing I grabbed was a bread knife. Not practical exactly, but when adrenaline and fear is coursing through your brain, you'll take the first thing you can grab. I remember trying to wake up my dad, who was passed out like a drunken sailor. We never found the man, and he did not attempt to come inside again. Had I not relocked that door or decided to check, prank or not, I dread to think of what might have happened to me that night. I've seen some stuff in my life, but people are always the ones that scare me. This story takes place around mid-2016, right in the heat of that whole killer clown trend. I don't know if trend is really the right word there, but I digress. A lot of people have stories from around this time. It was fall break of 2016. My cousin and I were both in middle school, me in 8th and him in 7th. I was staying over at his house one night during fall break. There were quite a few people in his home. Me, my cousin, his 10-year-old brother, his 3-year-old sister, 3-month-old baby brother, his dad, and his stepmom. Let me try to explain the layout of the house and yard. They lived in a rather large double-wide trailer that they'd bought and had on a flattened part of a hill. Their driveway was a rather steep gravel slope that connected to the road at the bottom of said hill. Behind the house and up the hill was nothing but woods. The nearest neighbor's home was slightly down the hill to the left, closer to the road. That was our grandparents' home. With the layout set up, let me continue onward with the story. As I said, my cousin and I were the only ones still awake. We were watching TV, probably some shitty sitcom on Nick at Night or something. We kept hearing these weird noises in the woods behind the home. Now, we could see out into the woods from the window in the living room where we were sitting, but we didn't pay much attention. It was kind of windy, plus my uncle had lots of motion lights outside the home. In the back facing the woods, the side door close to the driveway, on the slightly elevated porch that overlooked the front yard and road, so we weren't too worried about anyone or anything actually being outside. If there were, surely they would have triggered the lights already. We had heard lots of stories and watched YouTube videos around this time about the whole killer clown thing. To be honest, I didn't really believe it was real. I thought it was a bunch of people sharing prank videos to catch on a trend. Something made up just to get some clickbait views, you know. Plus, we live in a small nothing town in northeast Tennessee, where everyone and their dog owned some sort of firearm. That included my uncle, a retired veteran. We were never afraid of anyone dressing up as a clown trying out for a quick jump scare and a funny reaction video. There we were, sitting on the couch watching the TV show. The only light was the TV, and the dim light above the kitchen sink only a few feet behind us. All of a sudden, the back motion detector light came on. We didn't really think anything of it at first. The lights were on 10-minute timers. If it detected one movement, it would stay on and turn off after 10 minutes if no other movement was detected. After 10 minutes, they went back off, so we figured it was just an animal. Not too uncommon an occurrence for them to set the lights off. After 20 minutes, I went to the bathroom down the hall. I was doing my business and washing my hands. When I was coming back out, though, I noticed the motion light on the side of the house by the side door that entered the laundry room had come on. I swore I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. Then the doorknob started rattling quickly, like someone was trying to open it. I ran into the living room and got back on my spot on the couch. Luckily, the blinds were shut, so whoever that was didn't see me. I knew my cousin had already heard the same thing I did, because he was already up and halfway to his dad's room to wake him up. At that point, I saw the light from the front porch come on. I got up to look out the window and looked out onto the porch. By this point, my uncle had his pistol and flashlight and was out on the front porch looking for whoever or whatever this was. My cousin and I were behind him on the porch watching. He looked around with the flashlight for a bit. When he finally saw it, there at the bottom of the hill, hiding in the ditch by the road, was a clown in a crappy costume. He just looked at us and waved. My uncle fired a warning shot at him, and the clown ran across the road and into the woods. My cousin and I didn't sleep anymore that night. My uncle stayed out on the porch for a few more hours to make sure no skulking clowns came back. I remember him telling us not long after the shot was fired, he heard what sounded like an ATV starting up and driving away. Troublesome kids were always and still are an issue in that area. There were houses somewhat close to each other, but far enough away that you couldn't directly see them. The only house we could see was our grandparents' house. I don't doubt it was probably some high school kid playing a prank and trying to scare whoever the house's occupants were. Years after reading some more experience with these clowns and of people's lives actually being threatened, though, it scares me to think of what he would have tried to do if he was actually able to get into the home. Good morning, all. So, to start, this happened when I was 18, and I'm currently 33. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky and lived right next door to the senator, actually, who had bought our neighborhood when it was just old farmland and woods. She was quite old at the time, and is still alive today as well. She bought this land back in the 70s before she was even a senator at all. She had a lot of money from her parents, I guess. There was a little backstory to understand why and how I lived right next to her. When I was 18, my yard backed up to the senator's house. I worked her farmland and did chores for her, just to make some extra cash during the summer. The senator had massive amounts of land still that backed up into unused public land that went on for miles and miles. Mainly tiny streams, fields, trees, nothing too exciting really. It was next to a small highway that we had to cross to get to the next part of the wood lines. My friend, who we'll call Auntie, also did the chores and land work. He had a little brother who we'll call Willie. He was about 15. We all grew up in an area that was pretty safe, so our parents let us do whatever we wanted and just told us to be back at a decent time. We often explored these lands during the day to see how far we could go, or even if we could find anything in the woods that would be cool to explore. Of course, usually we didn't find anything, just some makeshift campsites for what we assumed was hunting or people camping in the wilderness. One day, we went pretty close to dusk, and we happened to bring flashlights just in case it got too dark. This was during the fall of 2008. The leaves were falling and coating the ground pretty thickly. As we were walking, I started to notice we had been going in a bit of a circle. I assumed we were lost, and we could no longer hear the highway that was nearby to us. The sun was going down pretty quickly, and we only had about an hour left of light. Eventually, it got completely dark, and we started walking around in the woods with our flashlights. It quickly got darker and darker, and it was at around 10 p.m. when we knew we were lost without hope. Before anyone asked why we didn't call with our cell phones, I grew up a relatively modest life, and my parents had only given me a flip phone, which didn't have very good service in this area. Throughout the night, we were doing our best to find the way back to where we came, but it was near impossible in these dark, very thick woods. My dad had always told me that when you're out in the woods, if it ever becomes extremely quiet at any point, that means there's a much larger predator in the area. Now, mind you, we were technically in the Appalachian area, and we'd all heard the stories of what not to do while in the woods, especially at night. Auntie, Willie, and I were walking, when suddenly everything in the area got eerily quiet, all except for one noise that appeared to be someone whistling. We all stopped dead in our tracks and began to look around in every direction. We wanted to verify where this sound was coming from. I think kind of unknowingly, Auntie whistled back. We all knew you were not supposed to whistle back in the woods, especially at night, in the Appalachian regions of the world. I hit him with the back of my hand. "Why would you do that?" The whistling started to grow louder and louder, so I told everyone to start running. As we were running, the whistling got softer and softer, and eventually it faded away altogether. If we weren't lost before though, well, we sure as hell were now. As we wandered around completely lost, it was now around midnight. There was a full moon lighting the area somewhat well. We happened to walk up on a shanty, an old run-down shack. It looked like it still had somewhat of a door on it. Through the door, we could see a small fire going. As any dumb person would, we opened the door and asked if anyone was around. At that moment, we all heard leaves crunching. We turned around at once, only to see nothing there. It was as if we were in a horror movie. The whistling started again, and it sounded like it was right next to us. We all turned towards the sound, and there she was, a woman in torn-up clothing and a really shoddy appearance, about 5 feet from us. We shifted back some and looked at her with the flashlights pointing at her. "Hello?" we said. As if something about that simple question made her lose her mind, she began screaming. It wasn't normal screaming either. It was a primal, animalistic yell. She lunged at Auntie. Out of reaction, he swung his flashlight directly at the lady's face, and she fell to the ground. We all started to run because we were terrified. She jumped up immediately and began to chase after us, still screaming all the while. I assume this lady had to be on some serious drugs because she was running extremely fast and the pain did nothing to her at all. We were hauling ass through the woods for at least 15 minutes. She was still chasing us. We eventually did lose her, or so we thought. We took a break behind some bushes before we started to hear the whistling again. We sat there for at least an hour before we worked up the courage to keep running. As soon as we started, we could hear someone close to us start running as well. No longer did we hear the whistling, but we heard the steps chasing after us clear as day. We started to hear the highway again eventually, and finally found our way back. Assuming the woman was still chasing us, we got as close as we could to the highway and flagged someone down. We were terrified she was waiting in the wood line. We were frantically trying to wave people down, but no one stopped. Finally, someone did stop and let us in. He was pretty spooked because our faces were extremely pale, and he asked us what happened. We explained, and he told us a lot of homeless and mentally incompetent people live out in those woods. He took us home soon after, and we never entered that place again. That was the day I shit my pants running. A little backstory. So, I was a security guard for this local company in my area. I was assigned to a water park with another guard who was regularly there keeping watch. He was to train me and show me around, tell me what codes open what doors and things such as that. The first thing I noticed was how quick he was to enter and leave the property. He never seemed to want to spend more than 10 minutes inside before he would already be eager to leave as soon as possible. Our first night was simple. There was nothing exciting or interesting going on, so the night was really dragging. After a few hours, I asked him if he'd ever experienced anything unusual while working there. He told me he'd had some problems with people trying to enter the property without permission, but that was really about it. He also told me he hated working there because of his encounters with those very same people. He said they really creeped him out because of how sneaky they were. He didn't really want to tell me too much. He was afraid I would leave my post, it seemed. That should have been a red flag for me, but I was too excited to let anything like that scare me. After a few more hours, our shift was over, so we clocked out and went home for the day. The next night, my boss called me to explain the security guard who was supposed to be my partner had now resigned. I was, of course, a little upset. Now I had to work a two-man post all by myself, with barely any knowledge of this place at all. Fast forward a few weeks now, I had started to really get the hang of the place and created my own routine with no issues at all. No break-ins, no vandalism, nothing. It was around 2 a.m. or so, and I was outside at the front of the property, completing my rounds, when I heard a door slam from inside. I jumped in surprise from just how loud it was. As I started to walk back into the property, I continued to hear various doors opening and closing. I could feel myself getting nervous. This was my first situation I'd ever had at this place. As I walked inside and started to check the doors and complete a round to make sure there was no one on the property, I got to this corridor where there was a set of stairs that led down to a door, which I noted was wide open. I walked down the stairs to close and lock that door. I was too scared to actually take a look inside. As I turned around to head back up the stairs, though, I noticed a man dressed in all black, now standing at the top of them. I took a step back and realized I was now cornered. If he wanted to try anything, I would have nowhere to run or hide. I politely asked the man if he needed something from me. He didn't reply. I then asked him how he managed to get into the property. He didn't reply to that either. He slowly turned his head and snapped his fingers. Then, from the left side of the staircase, another man slowly crawled to his side like a dog on all fours. I turned around and kicked the door open. I ran inside and locked myself in a bathroom as I called my boss and told them what I witnessed. They sent an armed security guard to my position to complete a walkthrough to make sure it was safe. As I got the call that the area was all clear, I came out and told them everything from start to finish. I soon realized, however, that they didn't believe me, so I clocked out and went home for the night. The next morning, I received a call from my boss, explaining that they'd checked the security footage from the night before, and what they told me horrified me. Every hour when I would complete my rounds inside the property, those same two men were following me throughout the facility, as if they were stalking me, like as if it was a game to them. After that, I asked for a new position because I was too horrified to work at that water park. Now I know why my trainer didn't want to work there anymore. I was 18 years old and worked in a mall clothing store. I usually worked the night shift, which meant leaving the store between 9 or 9:30 p.m. None of us thought anything about calling out good night and walking to our cars alone. Usually, the parking lot was full of all the other workers leaving at the same time. On this particular night, I was already in a great mood. I'd had a good evening at work and was going to meet up with my boyfriend when I got home. I was smiling and just thinking to myself as I walked. I got to the curb in front of the mall exit door to check for oncoming cars before I crossed over to where I was parked. It was not that far away, maybe 10 spaces away from the front. As I glanced up to verify where my car was, though, I caught the eyes of a man just sitting there in his truck. He was wearing a cowboy hat pulled down low over his face, as though he were trying to conceal himself. He was staring intently right at me. I froze in place and felt fear like I never had until that moment. I quickly snapped out of my trance and ran as fast as I could past his truck into my car, which was only spaces away. This was before key fobs, so I needed my physical keys to unlock the door. I always made fun of scary movies when the girl runs and drops her keys trying to get in. But it really does happen that way. I was shaking so badly I just could not get the key in the door. I kept dropping the damn things. I felt like I was in a bad movie. Seconds later, I was sitting in the car shaking extremely badly. I had to sit there for a moment or two before I could drive off. The man had not chased me. He didn't leave and continued to sit there. Later in the evening, I finally managed to calm down. I felt like an idiot, thinking I'd gotten scared of someone's husband picking them up after work or something. The next day, I went back to work. Same night shift. I told everyone about what happened and how scared I'd been. I made fun of myself for being such a chicken, but made sure that someone walked out with me later that night. I stood at the door of the mall, ready to run back in if I saw anything was off, but the man was not there this time. I exhaled and my friend and I went to our cars, relieved that everything was okay. The following day at work, there was no talk of my fright from 2 nights ago. It was business as usual, really. About halfway into my shift, though, the manager suddenly walked up to me and said she needed to speak with me. She turned around and walked up to a cop that I hadn't noticed was there before. Curiously, I walked over. The manager wanted me to tell the cop about what happened that night. I felt silly telling him for some reason, because nothing technically happened. Once I'd finished telling him my story, though, he started asking me a lot of specific questions about this truck. Did I know the model, the exact color? Did I know the year? I finally said something about not wanting to get anyone in trouble. I had just freaked out a little and it was not really a big deal. The cop then explained that the night before, one of the ladies leaving for the night had been kidnapped, driven around to the back of the mall into an unlit area, and was beaten and I felt myself get lightheaded, and my vision went black for a moment. It dawned on me that I had seen that. My description of the truck matched the description of the victims. That was just the beginning. Our city now had a serial rapist, and it took them years to finally catch them. His wife was the one that actually figured out it was her husband and turned him in. It was a scary time, and women were terrified to be out alone after dark. At our mall, and I imagine the others as well, no one was allowed to leave alone anymore. The parking lot was now lit up 360, and they had security on site at all times, making sure we were all safe. We also started a chain call between the stores to let one another know if you saw anyone that made you suspicious or frightened, so everyone would be on guard. I always felt a bit guilty knowing that woman had been attacked that night. Back in the summer of 2016, I got my first job at 18 years old. I was excited about the work, but not about the commute. Without traffic, it was a 30-minute drive both ways, and I normally got off work around midnight. The last thing I wanted to do was drive half an hour to get home. During the first few weeks, I was still getting used to my new routine. One of the first things my mother told me was to keep an eye on my gas tank, and that if I ever needed more, I should leave early and stop on the way there, never on the way back. I understood her concern. I was a petite 18-year-old woman, and I looked even younger than I was. Being who I am, though, I half forgot and half ignored that advice. One night on my way home, I realized I legitimately did not have enough gas to get me to my exit. I pulled into the first station I could find, not caring about the brand or the cost of the gas. I decided to make it as quick as possible and only put in about $10 worth just to get myself out of there. The station was empty, and there were sketchy-looking people walking up and down the sidewalk. There were about 20 different angles someone could sneak up on you. I swiped my card and began pumping gas. Once I got to the $10 mark, I shut it off and printed out my receipt, thinking the worst was behind me. I was about to climb back into my car and book it home when a voice came from the tiny intercom above the pump. "Ma'am, there was a problem with your credit card payment." I paused and glanced at the guy at the counter. I felt chills spiral down my neck. He was one of those tall, gaunt, and sketchy-looking clerks, staring right out the window at me, beckoning me to come inside. I stepped back towards the gas pump and pressed the button on the intercom. "What's wrong with my card? I have the receipt and it says it went through just fine." I didn't try to hide the annoyance in my voice. I didn't like the look of this guy, or the way he sounded. "I just need you to come inside, ma'am. Your receipt is incorrect. I'm going to need to run your card in here." He replied a bit too quickly. I looked back at the guy through the window in frustration. There was no way I was going in there, where I would be all alone with him. He was staring at me wide-eyed. I stood my ground, pulled out my phone, and checked my credit card app. I held it up stupidly, as if he could see it from there. I then pressed the intercom button again. "It went through. I see it on my statement. I'm not coming in there." "Ma'am, if you attempt to leave, I'll call the police. I have your tag number, so please come inside." I shouted at him from across the parking lot. "You think they're gonna come over $10 in gas? Fuck you, I'm leaving." I walked a few steps around my car and gave him the middle finger. I was just about to walk back to the driver's side and get into the seat when I paused. He was mouthing something to me through the window. I would have ignored it, but he suddenly looked much more desperate than creepy. He kept beckoning me forward and calling out something that I couldn't hear. I must have made a weird look, because 5 seconds later he slammed a piece of paper on the window It looked like he had written it very hastily. "Guy in your car." I turned back around and noticed that my passenger rear door was now open a tiny crack, which it definitely had not been on the drive from work. I booked it inside the station. Once I was in there, the clerk locked the door behind me and told me to get down. He had his eyes on my car and a gun in his hand. I squatted down behind the counter and watched the security cameras as a tall guy in sweatpants and a windbreaker nudged my back door open, slid out, and jogged away into the night. Needless to say, I started freaking out. Turns out the clerk had noticed the guy hanging around the side of the building on the monitors. As soon as I pulled in, he made a beeline right for my car. He crouched down and opened the door, then slid himself inside as I was swiping my card, being careful not to close the door all the way so I wouldn't hear anything. The clerk had noticed all of this on the camera and immediately called the police, who arrived a few minutes later. They searched the area and my car, but were not able to locate the man or anything that would lead back to him. That gas station clerk probably saved my life, because who knows what would have happened if I had driven off with a stranger hiding in the back seat. I think the lesson here is obvious. It's not enough to be cautious. You have to stay alert and be suspicious but not stupid. Always listen to your mom. I was living in Fort Wayne for a short time. The house I stayed in was on the outskirts of the main city, set way back on a dirt road in Farmville. The house is over 200 years old, and I would regularly freak myself out because of the age, location, and my only other roommates being 2 cats. Anyway, during one of the coldest nights in January, somewhere around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, I heard someone frantically ring my doorbell at around 2:30 to 3 a.m. I slowly approached the door to get a glimpse of my unexpected company before they realized I could see them. Suddenly, I heard them thump across the wooden wraparound deck leading up to the front door and make their way to the big glass side door. I heard moaning and groaning and someone jiggling the doorknob. By this time, I'd called the cops and was cowering in my room with my pistol drawn. During the 25 minutes it took for the cops to make their way up there to investigate, I could hear and see the shadows of people outside each window, trying each one to see if it slid open. When the cops arrived, they walked around the house and only identified one set of footprints in the snow, one set of drag marks as well. They could identify where and when the person being dragged was seated down in the snow at various entry points while the other guy was checking for a way in. I moved shortly after, not because of the attempted entry, but because Fort Wayne is a terrible place to live. I work in a small building with 3 wings. My office is located in a little back hallway of one of these. I share the office with another girl, and it's usually pretty quiet. One evening, she and I were the only ones in our wing still there, when we both heard a door loudly shut out in the hallway. Needless to say, we were both confused. Upon peeking out, though, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The next 2 weeks, I was staying really late to catch up on hours so I could have a winter break. I began noticing these little noises in the hallway when I was positive no one else was in the building. It sounded like shoes sliding across the floor. This happened many times. Earlier in the evenings, it would just be me and the janitor, and she started getting really spooked out. She said she could hear doors slamming in one of the wings, even though everybody had already left. We investigated together one night to find that all of the doors were still properly locked, but in one, the kitchen light was on, even though the door was still sealed. The janitor freaked out because she knew she'd turned the light off before locking the door. I also recalled the light being on a couple of nights when I was the only one there. I started to ask around if other people in the building had experienced anything weird like that. One lady said some of her room decorations had moved around when she came back from the bathroom. There's another one that really creeps me out though. Soon after all of this, another lady said that one day she'd noticed a footprint right in the middle of her desk. To be honest, I'd rather it be paranormal stuff because the idea that there's a person living in our office really creeps me out.